Hey friends, price floors are a legal minimum price for a particular good or service. So why do we need a legal minimum price? Now, it's because the good is usually so cheap that the government needs to step in order to set a legal minimum price to protect producers. So price floors are usually set to ensure that certain producers have enough prices or income to make ends meet. So, for example, in New York City has a minimum wage of about $15 per hour, if I recall correctly. And this helps lower income workers survive in a state or even a city where it is so expensive and you can spend about $10 to $20 per meal on average. So, this shows how price floors act as a legal minimum price for workers and their labor. This is a price floor diagram. And once again, despite its name, price floors are usually set above market equilibrium, as we see over here, where the $15 price floor is above the equilibrium price. Why is it set above market equilibrium? Because the original market price set by the free market is usually too low to make anything affordable for producers and could threaten their income. So the price floor protects producers from earning too little. So let's look at this price floor diagram and let me take you through what it is in detail. Initially, before the price floor, the market sets a price equilibrium at this level PE. But in the context of New York City, I believe the New York federal government sets a minimum wage of $15 per hour worked. And this is the price floor over here. So now if you think about it, if you are a worker in New York City and you receive this minimum wage, you're more willing and able to sell your labor. You're more willing and able to work. So this can actually increase the quantity supplied of workers above QE to the point QS over here. But if you think about it, if now you are a business instead of a worker, and if you're a business in New York City hiring workers, now your willingness and ability to hire workers fall. And therefore, this is reflected as QD in the diagram, which is lower than the equilibrium quantity. So naturally, if the number of workers who are willing and able to work are higher than the number of firms, the number of businesses who are willing and able to hire, this can lead to a surplus of workers, which is reflected over here, this gap between QD and QS. So that is the implication of a price floor on the labor market as a result of imposing minimum wages. And as we have discussed in the previous video, this surplus leads to two types of consequences. Firstly, consequences on markets as a whole, and secondly, consequences on different stakeholders. And as with my previous video on price ceilings, let me walk you through these diagrams to explain what exactly the implications are and how are these implications reflected in an economic diagram. So firstly, imagine if we do not even have a minimum wage in New York City. This would be the price of labor, also known as wage, and this would be the quantity of labor that are being hired. This is the original consumer surplus reflected in this green triangle over here. And this is the original producer surplus reflected in this blue triangle over here. Now imagine if the New York City federal government imposed a price floor on labor, also known as a minimum wage on labor of $15 an hour. This is how the market could be affected. So firstly, as we've mentioned earlier, the first consequence on markets would be that of a labor surplus. And this is reflected in the diagram as this gap above the equilibrium price. Now, there are some secondary implications as a result of this surplus. Firstly, this could lead to firm inefficiencies. Now, if you think about this in the context of food, so for example, a price floor on food, the government needs to dispose the surplus food that are being produced. So the government needs to buy the food, they need to spend money on this food and find a way to get rid of it. This could also lead to overallocation of resources and allocative inefficiency to either the production of food or to the allocation of resources in terms of work, as we see in this diagram. Secondly, how are price floors impacting different stakeholder groups? Let us use this diagram to walk you through how each stakeholder group is affected. So firstly, let's talk about consumers, right? Previously, before the price floor was imposed, consumer surplus is this large green triangle over here. But now we see that this triangle shrinks from that triangle above to just areas A and B in this diagram. We also notice that C used to be consumer surplus, but now it is a welfare loss. So that is something to bear in mind. Similarly, the producers also become worse off. So initially, producer surplus was this giant blue triangle. And now this new producer surplus is only reflected as area D in this diagram. And we see that once again, a portion of producer surplus is being lost as welfare loss. And the most interesting thing to take note of is that welfare loss is no longer just the combination of areas C and E, but instead it is a combination of areas C, E, F, G, and H, right? This gigantic red area in the diagram. So why exactly does this exist? Well, let's think about the theory behind why there are certain changes in the diagram. Firstly, in terms of consumers, consumers become worse off as a result of price floors. Firstly, now consumers are worse off because they pay higher prices for lower quantity. In the context of labor and minimum wage in New York City, consumers are businesses who are trying to hire manpower. So previously, you would hire labor and pay them PE, but now as a result of the price floor, you have to pay them $15 an hour. So you're paying essentially a higher price for a lower quantity because you can only hire fewer workers now. In terms of producers, also known as workers in this example, they gain because now they receive higher wages, but this is assuming that they get employed. So as we've discussed earlier, firms now can only have the budget to afford a lower quantity of workers. So those workers who are lucky enough to work will get a higher wage. But unfortunately, those who are unfortunate to in finding jobs no longer receive that wage, and they could potentially be worse off. Next, in terms of the government, well, if you think about this in terms of food, so for example, a price floor on agriculture, governments need to buy excess surplus because there is an overproduction of that particular food item. And buying excess surplus will be a burden on the budget for the government because they need to spend some money to buy the food, the excess food. And more importantly, this could result in opportunity cost because this budget could have been spent on other things, such as healthcare, education, etc. But no, it is being spent on buying excess food. And it is this principle that explains why the welfare loss for price floors is so big. I admit that this is more relevant for food, so price floors on food, as compared to labor. But this huge welfare loss area stems as a result of the potentially endless opportunity costs that the government incurs when they spend a portion of their budget buying excess surplus of food. And lastly, bearing this in mind, other countries can also be worse off because now competition and production for goods are protected by price floors, right? So this could be something to bear in mind as a consequence of price floors. So to sum up, there are three key takeaways on price floors. As a whole, price floors are a legal minimum price, and they're usually set to protect producers. There are two kinds of producers: producers of agricultural products, so price floors on food, or maybe even producers of labor, so people like you and me who work to get a living wage. The second key takeaway is that price floors will result in a surplus, as we see in this gap over here. So the surplus leads to other secondary implications, such as an overproduction of agricultural products, or maybe an opportunity cost if the government decides to buy excess surplus. And lastly, most importantly, price floors only benefits producers, be it producers of agricultural products or producers of labors like workers. And this as a whole makes consumers and the governments worse off because of opportunity costs incurred or higher prices that needs to be paid.